Chapter 2. A Passport to the People. During the next decade or so, much rousing stuff will be written about the way the Second World War came to Washington, D.C., how its government drones came to regard their clerking chores as a holy office, how the War and Navy departments, after three-quarters of a century of continental peace, miraculously assumed the cloak of Mars and ordered vast strategies with the dispatch of Julius Caesar. Mobilization Day was here, and it had been the point of M-Day to help the United States relive in a streamlined way the murderous calm of Prussian strategist Karl von Clausewitz, who, being awakened to receive the news that the war was on, mumbled, "G2, file number 8375, and then turned over to catch the rest of his sleep. It may turn out, in the long view, that this is what America achieved, but as one who can enjoy only the distorted view of a victim is obliged to report, once the calamity of Pearl Harbor had registered, Washington most resembled that crisis in the old Keystone comedies, when the resting firemen, grown amiable on undisturbed sessions of beer and games of pinochle, are electrified by the alarm, and, diving headlong down the greasy pole, start to clump importantly in every part of town. Washington suddenly became a capital city where everybody knew the grand strategy of the war, but nobody knew whether his job on Monday would be the one he left on Saturday. Men who had worn a blue suit and were formerly known as secretaries or executive assistants appeared in a few weeks wearing checkroom tags in their buttonholes and bearing the title of coordinator. Whatever operating crew the engineers of the M-Day plan had figured on, they had possibly overlooked the huge staff of government hacks who had grown in a decade to be most of the resident population of Washington. In 1917, the city had 38,000 government workers. In February 1942, it had close to 250,000. And in spite of the pawky fun that has been made of this bureaucracy, it was the Secretariat of America's war, and might be led or disciplined, but could not be dissolved. Perhaps in post-war memoirs, the legions of the unfooled, those Americans determined not to be taken in by human nature, will read with admiration of the quiet and shrewd work of many a government department with a funny name. We shall marvel at the political and economic crises that were caught and strangled anonymously by the President's kitchen cabinet. When all the play is over, we may know from the workings of Department of Agriculture Economics why and how, after many a blunder, the American food crop of 1942 was to be the most abundant in history. Considering the tough, infantile pride of both Americans and Britons whenever they are called on to compare each other's ways and institutions, we may learn how Americans as native as Carl Sandburg or Bing Crosby met several times a week with Britons as fundamentally British as Anthony Eden or J.B. Priestley, and somehow managed Lend-Lease, or combined operations, with a success in equal responsibility unknown in the economic or military history of two modern nations. But after the agony of Pearl Harbor, not many people in Washington, and fewer still outside, could know enough about these things to take courage from them. They were looking first for somebody to blame, and not since the return of crews from the defeated Armada to their native Spain have Navy men anywhere been so continuously under the scrutiny of the evil eye. At his press conference on the first Tuesday after Pearl Harbor, the President listened sympathetically while a reporter complained that the service departments were in such a tizzy of importance that it took 4 hours to release a communique of 5 or 6 sentences. The President asked for a little charity. After all, he said, those boys are in a spot. "We're in a spot, too," the newsman replied. "I know it," said the president, "but you don't have somebody introduced to you every few minutes who looks at you and wonders were you the leak." It was natural enough that visitors to Washington made bitter fun over the machinery of war administration as it creaked into high gear. In the first month or two, what Americans wanted, as would any people newly at war, was to feel some certain pride in their army and navy. But at the end of February, besides instances of individual bravery and the tireless stand on Midway and Bataan, there were not many places to go for a boast. The Japanese, whose audacity on the 7th of December had been diagnosed by most Americans as an itch for suicide, had in less than 3 months conquered Thailand and Malaya, and were pouring through Burma. Hong Kong and Singapore had surrendered to them. They were masters of the Philippines, of Guam and Wake. They were entrenched in the Netherlands Indies, in Sumatra and Sarawak and Celebes. They had captured Bali and isolated Allied reinforcements. They had submarines scouring the Indian Ocean from the newly captured base at Penang, and were sustaining an aerial offensive over a 4,500-mile sweep between southern Burma and the island of New Britain. If the cities of the eastern seaboard were too far from these disasters to feel their confidence shaken, there was a melancholy tune being picked up every night in the Navy Department from the wireless messages of oil tankers going down off the coasts of New Jersey, Delaware, and the Carolinas. In the downpour of these humiliations, many publicists and politicians hastened to speak for the American people and reassure them that even if at the moment they looked bedraggled, they were really fighting mad and would stay so until the war was won. But this was a hangover from the literature of advertising, and especially from the sumptuous publicity that had been laid on to the American defense program like the fetching armor of a bride. For almost 3 years, ever since the first British and French orders had come in, and the first British investments in America had been used to build factories in the United States and Canada, the American people had been hypnotized by accounts of their own technical genius. They had been promised feats in the mass production of tanks, planes, and guns that would make the well-meaning craftsmen of Europe lay down their arms in shame. The plea of Premier Reynaud on the eve of the fall of France for clouds of planes from America, which did not then even exist in blueprints, was only the most pitiful example of a misconception held everywhere, and not least by Americans. It was the disparity between American power, in terms of the tried weapons of modern war, and the American potential. It's true to say, I think, that not many people tried, except from motives of fear, to falsify the picture of what American production could do. But when a powerful nation, proud of its technical skills and at all times susceptible to moral crusades, is told from the other side of the world that its machines and its moral support are being counted on, and when that nation is gallingly listed as a neutral, the temptation to win the war for the side you favor is as irresistible as the conviction of a cheerleader that the game is really won or lost by organized shouting. When the sympathies of the world's chief creditor nation are strongly felt, and when it is not spilling blood, then it must believe for its own self-respect that its machines are doing the trick. Long before the American declarations of war, it had become the habit of newspaper headline writers to comb through the day's news for any identification of an American plane, tank, or gun. Thus, British raids on Germany were reported under the headline, "American Bombers Blast Ruhr," with nobody minding very much if the reader mistook the word bombers to mean human beings. Once the American war was on, then the magazines bloomed with luscious 3-color charts and graphs showing American production spiral, starting down with everybody else's, but zooming by the end of the current year at latest into the stratosphere. Nobody heard much about how the British and Russians felt about the weapons they'd had and how they stood up in mechanized warfare. We here in the United States studied our own production story and assumed the victory. This frustration, pride in the so bulging muscles of our arms, and impatience that we somehow weren't landing any considerable blows, was the mood of most cities of the eastern seaboard in the late winter of 1941-42. Washington especially was a trying city to live out the war in because it was the capital of American activism, an activism that so far had seemed to pay off so little. Even when you have once made this reflection, Washington is a government town first and last. It has no separate life as a city to lose yourself in. If, as somebody said, the new American frontier is government buildings, then the new pioneer is the government worker, with an undramatic future. It was a boom town based on a deep gusher of memoranda, and its prospectors, crowding the hotels and boarding houses from every city across the continent, came panning for contracts. To a correspondent who wanted faithfully to report what the war was doing to America, life in Washington in those days was an ecstasy of frustration. Here, everybody admitted, was the heart and hive of the war effort. All the hinging decisions of the war were supposed to be on file here, the confidential dope, the brain waves that sent the correct impulses to a garrison in Iceland and to a Marine on Midway. But once you have recovered from the awe of this idea, you tend to pick up some pretty guileless assumptions. You assume that the Washington office of the junior senator from New Mexico is the essence of New Mexico, bottled and sent to Washington for reference and tasting. Arguments about trucking tariffs over a state border you get to think of as a feud between two lobbies or two congressmen from those states. You learned, without bothering to check firsthand, a sort of catechism of the American war effort and its issues. Only when you leave Washington do you begin to suspect that you already have picked up a patter as slick and monotonous as a vaudeville comedian's routine. In the bar of the press club, you nod your head benevolently over what you take to be one of the unsolved problems of government, namely, how to bring the war home with equal force to 130 million Americans living, regrettably, far away from Washington. If you ever think of these people, it is of stubborn provincials staring at a government form they do not want to sign. You listen to the president plead for equality of sacrifice, and you agree that clerks and storekeepers ought to match with war bonds the discomfort and loneliness of their sons in the Philippines. But only when you have an hour alone and recall the living map of America do you wonder how the word sacrifice can be made to mean the same thing for a farmer in Iowa whose land is rolling and full of food, and a farmer in Vermont who before he could plant the seed of a decent meal must have spent days digging up rocks and glacial stones. Or how the farmers of southwestern Kansas, whose farms blew away in the dust storms, can feel that they have a stake in anything but a few blades of grass that will hold the soil. If these thoughts cross your mind, you then remember that you are sitting in the shadow of the Department of Agriculture, which, after all, has statistics on these distressing hardships. You dismiss your misgivings as sentimental fantasies and go down to the State Department, there to listen to news of statecraft that purges away, by the hypnosis of its own wondrous vocabulary, all gnawing concerns over men and women and four-letter words. Yet to one who has known Ely, Nevada, or Alpine, Texas, better than Washington, D.C., these thoughts will return. Perhaps you dare to think the war was changing the people and the landscape of America in ways that Washington undoubtedly knew, but only as the curve of a graph. There were things that those 130 million exiles from the nation's capital conceivably felt and knew about the war that no Washington correspondent could possibly read into a handout or throw off from an imagination, however lively. It was with these misgivings, and with a little good hope springing from 100 memories of the sights and sounds of the American landscape, that, at the end of February 1942, I set out to look for some of these things. I didn't know what I was going to look for, and was fairly untroubled by this aimlessness. When you go to look for something in a town, you usually find it, and of all forms of pretentious journalism, the hollowest is the feature story written by a man who knows beforehand the angle and the moral he is going to point out. Indeed, when I had doubts about my ignorance of America, and without wishing to be coy, I can honestly report that after the first 3 or 4 tours of the United States, these doubts sometimes are overwhelming. I would read stories that undertook to tell you how Chicago felt about the war, or what was the spirit of the population of the South or Midwest, or of the workers in the California aircraft plants. These assignments are innocently thought to contribute to popular morale. One is asked for color stories about places that perhaps have only the wrong sort of color to offer a nation at war, or for rousing accounts of the patriotism of people one had never known at peace. It seems there are few editors alive who will hesitate to point out to the departing reporter the significance of places and people neither he nor you have ever seen. It is one of the routine dishonesties of people with a popular cause. The reading of this confident drivel, which is another of the whelps gotten by publicity on journalism, restored me, however, to a trust in unaided observation. Since it is impossible for one person to know the enormous variety of scientific techniques that can alone describe industrial production for war, I thought such a report could safely be left to fortune and the 15th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. I intended to see what the war had done to people, to the towns I might go through, to some jobs and crops, to stretches of landscape I loved and had seen at peace, and to let the significance fall where it might. I had been warned that to see America at war, I would need a wad of credentials sufficient for a paper chase from coast to coast. I did not believe this because one of the easy charms of America at peace has always been the accessibility of people and places you wanted to know about. If you came to a town bearing an odd name or plying an industry that interested you, all you had to do was go to the Chamber of Commerce or knock on the factory gate, and they would bring the town on over for you. At the War Department, they told me darkly about some visiting British correspondents who had proceeded on this knowledge, and had been taken through bomber plants by the mere act of flashing a borrowed membership card in the National Press Club. Their tracks had been charted by the Public Relations Bureau of the War Department as sedulously as those of any dinosaur. And anybody who came afterward was clearly a suspicious character. The disposition to regard visiting Britons as enemy aliens is, of course, a shrewd instinct, and much healthier American tradition lies back of it. As a correspondent for a British newspaper, I determined, therefore, to woo the War and Navy departments. On my first visit to the War Department, I was told by a junior officer the room number of the public relations officer I had to see. I followed the directions and soon found the door with that number. Unfortunately, the forbidding word "women" was printed plainly on it, and I couldn't believe that even in our decadent Pluto democracy, public relations would gain anything from being conducted so surprisingly. This was getting me nowhere that I wanted to go, and it was later on this happy day that I had the luck to throw myself, at a friend's recommendation, on the mercy of one Captain Fox of the British Supply Mission. Having first told me that the War Department required 8 copies of every application you filed to visit a war plant, he at once offered to do this chore for me. Several months later, I figured he must have spent the better part of the spring doing the octuplating for my casual visits. This tiny Newfoundlander a dapper, mustachioed man with a skeptical blue eye and a chin against which transatlantic brusqueness broke as foolishly as the Pacific against the rocks of Monterey, simply had the knack of public relations, in the sense that he found out what you wanted to do, took the risk of your honesty, and would go to bat for you with the people who could help. Either from instinct or providential accident, he took me at once to the War Department and led me before a mild-eyed colonel with an Irish prefix to his name. The colonel duly recounted the now historic finagling of the visiting British correspondents, who, it should be said in fairness, were hot Britons. A hot Briton may be defined as one sent over on a special mission to the United States, chiefly because he has never visited the country before. The colonel implied, as tactfully as possible, that he would do his best to try not to hold my breeding against me, but he couldn't promise that all the factories I approached would let me in, or that public relations officers would be willing to transmit to me what they call restricted information. At an unarranged signal from the sitting fox, I said as meekly as an aquiline face will allow that I would go only where the army wanted me to go, write what they would permit, and that I could keep an army secret as well as some officer friends with a buzz on. He seemed to accept this pleasantly, and leaned forward to apologize for the restrictions. You see, we are instructed that every citizen of a foreign country, including British subjects. I told him that they did right to treat the British that way, and that, as an American, I should expect the same trouble in England. His face opened up like a September oyster. I was an American citizen, then? Alors, I was an American citizen. The colonel rose, gave rapid orders to two of his lieutenants, who promptly opened drawers and walked around their desks twice in my honor. Excepting a slight brush with a colonel in Pasadena, this was the last time I ever experienced a moment of tension with the army. The colonel asked me where I lived, thought kindly of New York, inquired if I was married, and had propagated my kind. I did not have a picture of the little fellow, but somewhere, somehow, I had to mention his name for the record. No sooner had I got beyond the given names, John Byrne, than the colonel flushed, and his eyes were hot with pride. His grandfather on my mother's side, I explained. Perhaps at another time and in another place the colonel would have embraced me. As it was, he called for papers, phoned for majors and captains, and told them to get the United States ready for my tour. He was too happy and obviously too sensitive to apologize. He merely remarked that he'd been thinking how much accent I'd lost. I don't wish to convey that any member of the United States Army is subject to attacks of nepotism, even at one generation once removed. I was given no more than my legitimate right as a foreign correspondent anxious to report to an ally on the American people at war. It may appear from the foregoing that my experience with the armed forces was unhappy or whimsical, but it was nothing like so bad as I had been told to expect by civilian stuffed shirts, whose chief claim to virtue was their daily thanks to God that they were not brass heads. On the contrary, I came to the surprising conclusion that the Army and Navy were more reasonable to deal with than most government departments. If you knew what you wanted to do and what you didn't want to do, you could quickly make good relations. And where there are good relations, there is, by definition, no need of diplomacy. Everything was now ready. I had been sworn in, cleared, signed, and sealed, and was to be allowed to observe almost anything, from the functioning of a naval district to the operation of link trainers, the upkeep of landing barges, and 1,000 other privileges that would delight the heart of a graduate engineer. Unfortunately, newspapers are seldom written by such men. I was a mere foreign correspondent, which is to say a man who is helped to report on mechanical processes he will never understand, and to be entrusted with secrets he would never know enough to use. Of course, I had a vain desire to be able sometime to step aboard a B-19 bomber, as long as it stayed aground, but I knew that my chief interest would be in people, and that there would be much left untold in any story I wrote about mechanized warfare, and practically nothing about the splendid courage of the nation's airplane riveters. The reader ought to be warned, however, that I was not going out on any debunking expedition. For even though I was born at a time when it was compulsory to cut your literary teeth on debunking, I always had uncomfortable misgivings, which later became a conviction, that debunking was a slightly hysterical form of disappointed sentimentality. On the other hand, in the past year or two, we have swung to the opposite extreme, and in much public speaking and writing, we tend to assume that war will endow people with a completely different and more elevated set of emotions to live their lives on. This overreaction has appealed especially to my own generation, which fretted away so much of the 20s and 30s in enjoying wide experience, going places, doing things, looking for life anywhere but home, spreading its emotions wide and thin, and hoping, a little pathetically, that a few deep loyalties would be delivered with the milk. Consequently, in the first month or two of the American War, it was possible to hear, at least among so-called educated young Americans of the Eastern Seaboard, in their 30s and wondering whether to enlist, more surprising mawkishness about patriotism and the need to atone than from a convention of politicians or bishops in their best exhibitionist stride. I left then with this single lingering prejudice. I was theoretically willing to be convinced that the war would improve the quality of human emotions. But like the man from Missouri, I wanted to be shown. That ends chapter 2. Thank you for listening.